Welcome back, everyone. This is the weekly performance report from August 5th to August 9th. So let's jump into this. Noticeable activities over the last week. Earlier this week was a big buying moment, especially after the past few weeks of not buying anything. So due to what is alleged to be the drop in the market from the yen carry trade, I purchased some St. Joe, some Grown Rogue, some A-Mark Precious Metals, a little bit more of Valeris, and a new position, High Tide. And I sold roughly 25% of my Genius sports stock. So I used Monday morning's yen carry trade unwind to deploy some capital. It's always interesting observing people's commentary during moments like these. It's one of the best opportunities you have as a person to identify the wishy-washy personalities on Twitter. Their hearts so badly desire the despair and suffering of America. It's interesting to see so-called Americans and libertarians cheer on the catalysts for the collapse of America, or its stock market and all the people whose 401ks are pretty much the function of what occurs in the stock market and so on and so forth. Ultimately, this newsletter is about making money. The reason I mention the above is because these people are blinded by their bias. And it's in that bias that they'll make the wrong calls. And the reason that that's relevant is because you, the follower of that person, will be using their calls as input and information into your decision-making process. For instance, they'll tell you that this is the beginning of a massive global unwind and to batten down the hatch. And that this is the consequence of large-scale funds playing games and getting greedy. See, they want people to suffer to karmically right the wrongs of the perceived sins. It's a just world fallacy they perversely possess. And fallaciousness in thought translates to fallaciousness in action. Of course these people are right, one out of every few dozen times. The interesting part of that is that they will still take massive losses on their portfolio, albeit only temporarily. If they really thought this was the beginning of something much larger, you'd think that they'd raise more cash. However stupid, at least those who have been sitting in cash since the '08 crisis at least walk their talk. Sure, these money managers might degross, but they'll still be 90% long with maybe 5 or 10% in cash. If they really thought that this was the beginning of something much larger, why wouldn't they be in 30% or 50% cash? Perverse incentives are a large reason. If they're sitting in cash for too long, they'll get redeemed by their limited partners. But there's another reason. It's because they don't actually believe it. They treat speech cheaply, and their so-called calls are more a wanton desire than an actual prediction, insofar as you define the word believe by behavior. They say they believe it, but they don't act as though they believe it. How do they reconcile this difference? They don't. They merely keep running their mouths and talking the same shit that they've always talked. And this is a crucial point for you to understand. You realize much of their talk is rhetorical and tongue-in-cheek. And if you pay attention, they almost always hedge their speech. They'll also never account for all their wrong calls, and matter of fact, will tell you that they said something different than what they actually did say. They're not accountable for what they say, and they'll be damned if you try to hold them accountable. The point is that you need to be able to identify these actors in your investment circle. What makes this all the more tricky is that some of these people are actually good investors. And that brings us to the expression, watch what they do, not what they say. Of course, that's also difficult because you don't actually have transparent access to their portfolio in any real time besides a quarterly public release filing, if that even. I tried stressing this dynamic in an article that I've written that I titled Dunbar Effect in Twitter. The point I was trying to emphasize in that article is that you need to be familiar enough with people to recognize how much of the above dynamics they possess. That way you'll know how seriously to take the rhetoric and to be able to identify whether it's rhetoric or not. Many people give too much credence to what others say without being familiar with that person's track record. And that's dangerous due to the impression it might make upon you and subsequently your investments. And just as importantly, you can't do that if you're following hundreds upon hundreds or even thousands of people. On a final note, you must be mindful that these dynamics explain grifters and shysters, but it also describes the everyday person. Everyday people chronically run their mouths, but they don't act on it. If you were naive enough to think that people's speech reflects their actions, you'd be terribly mistaken. Although they sound confident, their behavior demonstrates their lack of confidence. This is the whole Annie Duke, do you want to bet dynamic that I've discussed before. And just to finish that off, the whole Annie Duke dynamic, the way I've interpreted it, which could by extension mean not Annie Duke's, but mine, but she inspired it nonetheless, is when someone's just saying something, it doesn't matter, just fill in the blank, anything, really. Just anything from, oh, that grocery store has those kinds of apples, to, oh, that McDonald's has a playground, the one down the street across, the way, that one has a playground. You're like arguing with your wife, no, it doesn't. And then, or even more severe things like EV cars put out much less emission than other cars. Now, of course, you have to define the parameters, and that's what they're doing, is they're basing things upon ambiguous and obfuscating language to be right, which is just to say, when you're not held accountable to any standards, you can be right. But that's another point. I can't remember. I got an argument a few years ago about the amount of emissions that cows create. And then I think that was the argument. And then I looked it up, and you found out that study that most people cite when they make that argument was actually debunked, and they retracted the publication. So their research and quote-unquote confidence is grounded on that. And then more interestingly enough, they don't take back what they say once you bring that to their attention, which means that another argument I make about people is that they don't need facts to be right. They need facts to feel good about thinking they're right. Like, people don't need facts. They just have their opinions and their emotions, and that's enough. My point is, in any of these circumstances, you can say to them, because they'll sound very confident and ungiving and lack of nuance or context, and they're speaking absolute and totalitarian ways. And you just say, do you want to bet? Like, how much do you want to bet that those tires, on that road bike are supposed to be aired up to no more than 80 psi? And they'll just swear up and down. It's like, okay, let's bet. Or, oh, that food over there doesn't have much protein. Or it could be anything. And do you want to bet? Do you want to bet? Do you want to bet? And what you find out is, no, they don't. And of course, they all give the same ostensible cop-out bullshit of, oh, I don't bet. It's like, okay. Yeah, that's a convenient cover-up for you to not have to be accountable. Like, I can say whatever I want to and not be accountable for it in any meaningful, tangible way. Like, okay. And that's what people do. So, with that said, let's get on. I ended the week up 2.2%. And other than high tide, there are no brand new names to this. And like I noted, I added the Grown Rogue. I think Monday, it was Monday. I made a tweet about this. Monday morning, I believe it was. I started the morning down 8%. It was either Monday or Tuesday. I started the morning down 8% and ended up closing the day down like 2.5%. And it was weird because the S&P was down like 4% to start off with, and then it ended down 3%. And I'm like, how did I go from being down 8 to down 2.5? And the S&P went, like, how did I outperform the S&P that day? And so I started looking at stuff, and I realized it was because Grown Rogue registered as opening down 20% that morning, which is quite interesting, and actually put in some limit orders, not quite down, I think roughly down 15% that got hit, or got filled, so that's good. And I think it pretty much moved back up to break even for the day. So that's how I managed to go from -8% to -2.5%. But I added share St. Joe, share Valeris, like I said, High Tide, and then however many shares of Grown Rogue, I don't know. And that's that really. So earnings are coming out. Glass House has earnings coming out. A lot of the cannabis names are reporting earnings in the past week, and structurally they're looking better. Of course, they're always up to their little BS games they play, but it's actually nice. They're actually improving internal metrics, which is good, because a lot of performative growth, in some sense, on some level of analysis, can happen from just the internal metrics getting better. You know, SG&A getting cut and CapEx being reduced and debt being paid. I mean, if you have a bunch of debt on the books at 12% interest rate and you're able to pay down that debt, I mean, you're saving tens of millions, hundreds of millions, depending on who you are and how much debt you have. So just paying down debt can really help you improve your margins and numbers in and of itself. So I'm seeing some of that, so that's good. I don't really have much else to say. I still have the other video to make. So I think I'll end it here. And thank you for watching. And until next time.